You guys, really pumped to be here with you. As you get to know me, you will probably very quickly discover, if you haven't already, I love to joke around. I like to say that sarcasm is my love language. And so if that's not yours, then just keep a safe distance. And if I'm being sarcastic with you, it really means I deeply love you and care about you and value you. If I'm always serious with you, you might want to question our relationship. But I like to joke around a lot. What that means is that it's pretty hard to offend me. You know, you can take a lot of shots, say a lot of things, and there aren't a lot of things that ruffle my feathers that much. However, I think that all of us likely have things that really get to us, things that grind our gears, things that kind of get our back up against the wall. I was thinking about one for me. And one is this phrase that I've heard quite a few times in my life about people, about others, even a couple times about myself. And it's this phrase or something like this, maybe you've heard before, and that's people never change. People never change. People don't change. People can't change. This idea that people, like, the way they are is the way they'll always be. That is like a triggering statement for me. I can't stand that statement. Now, hear me out. That statement is actually generally like kind of self-fulfilled. That statement is often quite true. People often don't change very much, especially when we become adults. Our tendencies and our routines and our patterns and our characteristics and our expressions and all that often don't change that much. Sometimes they become more vibrant expressions of that, but often the way we are is the way we stay for a long time. However, I don't think that means that the statement is true. I think it means that that's often the reality. That statement bothers me on a deep level because I think it's so antithetical to what the Bible teaches, what the faith community is all about. The idea that people are kind of imprisoned and confined to the way that they've always been for the rest of their lives is one of the least hopeful, and I would even say one of the least empathetic statements that I think could ever be made about people. I want to share two reasons why I really struggle with the statement, people don't change, people can't change, people never change, however you want to say it. How someone is, where we write people off, how they stay like that forever. And I want to show these two reasons, and each will probably take about half of my time up here. The first reason is this, and I'm going to, in a moment, share a passage from the book of Ephesians, but I believe this statement, people never change, people can't change, whatever, is so antithetical to what we in the church call the gospel. That's the good news of Jesus. The fact that God came to rescue a sinful people who were rejecting him. God came to offer them a life change. He came to give his life, to sacrifice his life, in the understanding that by that their lives could be radically and enormously shifted and changed and made different forever. You've probably read this passage or heard this passage if you've been in the church for a while. But Ephesians chapter 2, this is what it says. It says, "As for you, all of us, you were dead in your transgressions and sins, in which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world and of the ruler of the kingdom of the air, the spirit who is now at work in those who are disobedient. All of us also lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts. Like the rest, we were by nature deserving of wrath." I'm going to read those three verses again, and I'm going to point out three things, three ideas that I'd like for us to hold on to. So, as for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins. So hold on to that idea. Dead in your transgressions and sins. Paul's talking about people who are now following Jesus, whose lives have been changed by who Jesus is, what they were like before that, how people were. So as for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins. That's the first thought to hold on to. In which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world and of the ruler of the kingdom of the air, the spirit who is now at work in those who are, here's the next one, disobedient. Those who are disobedient. More literal translations actually say sons of disobedience or sons of rebellion. We are children of like disobedience and rebellion. Parents in the room are like, oh yeah, I got toddlers, I get it. Okay, all of us also lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts. Like the rest, we were by nature deserving of wrath. Deserving of wrath. Again, a more literal translation would say children of wrath. So what Paul describes our state before being transformed by the work of Jesus, by being changed by the gospel, is this: dead in our sins, children of disobedience, and children of wrath. That's pretty brutal. That's pretty gnarly. If that is the message of the Bible and it just ended there and we just concluded that people never change, that people could never change, well, then Jesus would have never come. The whole point of the Bible, as we know, goes beyond this, that God looks at people in this state and says, you guys are dead in your transgressions and sins. Death is a big deal, right? Like death is kind of a serious condition. It's a serious issue, right? We meet many people where it's like this person, like even earlier, Jessica was talking about Felix's chronic struggle with leukemia. That's awful. That's brutal to think about. Like I was just chatting about it with him earlier, his journey through that. And that's awful. And you meet many people who have different varying degrees of sicknesses, like someone caught a cold or this or whatever. But none of us have ever been at a funeral where the person running the funeral is like, yeah, Uncle Fred is just going through like, a little round of death right now, and we're hoping he's going to recover soon. Like he's going to bounce back from this soon, right? Like this is a big deal. Death is a final, total thing. There's no coming back from that. We don't go to funerals expecting the person to pop out of the casket and be like, oh my goodness, okay, good, thank goodness. Like they've kind of moved past that. Death is not something we work out in our lives. It's not something we get past. It's not this idea of spiritual death. And in the Bible, sin is described as people being dead, lost, and blind. Those are kind of the three main descriptors in the New Testament. This idea of spiritual death shows something that's like, this is not something we can recover from. This is the new identity of a person. They are dead. All life function has ceased. All things that come out of life have ceased. And children of disobedience and children deserving wrath. This is a heavy description of who a person is. And the letter would just end here if the idea that people never change was true. Maybe you've had someone say that about you at some point in your life. People never change. People don't change. Well, I'm here to tell you that the Bible says something really different. It says that all of us have the ability in Jesus to be radically changed. Paul didn't just end at verse 3 and just be like, well, that's who we are. End of the book. Good luck. Have fun working out your spiritual death and your being a child of wrath and rebellion. This is what happens in verse 4. Here's the turnaround. But because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in transgressions. It is by grace you have been saved. But because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in transgressions. It is by grace you have been saved. None of us know anybody who has ever been physically dead who has come back to life. I haven't even ever asked you guys, but I'm sure if you had experienced that, I would already know about it. That doesn't happen. Death to life is impossible. But if that shift from death to life is possible, that type of change is possible, in the message of the gospel, the good news of who Jesus is, if his good news is greater than even the greatest depths of our own selfishness, our own brokenness, our own hurt, our own pain, if his good news is greater than all of that, that it could bring us from death to abundant life in him, then any shift, any change in a person's life is possible. Not because we're great, not because there's another awesome book that we can read to figure it out, not because some new routine or pattern, not because of some blog that we're reading that changes us, but because Jesus is someone who does not hold to the mantra or the idea that people never change, but he looks at us knowing that we can be different, and the things that hold us back, the things that break us, the thing that struggle with us, he looks at us and says, that could be different. That could change. Your life could actually be different than that. So that's the first reason I can't stand the statement. People never change. People don't change. Maybe you've used the statement before, and some of it's kind of cultural. Actually, ever since having kids, my wife and I have done a big audit of a lot of the things that we say. And we realize we say oh, I hate it when it's this, or I hate that, or or oh, that's scary, or things like that. And we realize, no, we use a lot of language that's really weird. We use a lot of really weird words that we don't really think through what they mean. And so many of us adopt cultural ideas, like talking about hating things or talking about things being scary, when fear is actually not really a positive thing for us to be sharing and stuff like that. And we adopt statements like people never change, and we often don't think about it too much because we're too fast paced to slow down and think about what we're doing, but we don't think about it that much because it's kind of often true. People often do continue in the patterns, but Jesus says, but that's not true. It doesn't have to be that way. really struggle with the statement because it is antithetical. It's opposite to what Jesus teaches. The whole message of the Bible, the whole story of Jesus, the whole idea of the gospel is predicated on the fact that change is possible and there's this great exchange that's available to anybody who would turn to Jesus. The second reason I can't handle this statement is because it's kind of in a similar vein, but really just how it deeply connects with my own personal story. In the time that I'm here, whether it's half a year or longer than that or whatever it is, I hope to share some of my story with you, and I hope to get to know some of your guys' stories. This morning I want to share a little bit about my story, and I'll tell you, when I share my faith story, some people in the church call it a testimony. I often usually don't talk about like specific sinful struggles, the particular sins I struggle with, because growing up in the church, I often felt like when people would share their story, a lot of times it was like kind of their resume of like, oh, look at all the bad things I did. It's kind of like glorifying sin. And then there's like this part at the end, it's like, oh yeah, Jesus did some stuff too. It's like, so I don't usually do that. But this morning I actually am going to share some specific things because I think it actually matters for kind of the point of the story. But I just want to be like outright and say, I don't think my sinful ways were like cool or glorious or anything like that. It's just kind of part of my story. So some of you know, I was born pastor's kid, grew up as a pastor's kid. During elementary, kind of just like went with the flow, was like an okay pastor's kid or whatever, didn't do anything too bad. Kind of mediocre. I was always aiming for like 50% on the test as being a pastor's kid. But we moved right before junior high, and since I was a pastor's kid, anything I went to was Jesus-y, right? It was like, everything, including my school, everything, any event. My parents were like, this is a fun event. I'm like, no, I know this is a Jesus event. You just wait. And it always was. But we went to these Christian schools. I started this new Christian school in Calgary in grade 7. And something really is really, this might sound silly to you, but it's really striking to me. What happened was I noticed that there were kids in my school who were like swearing. And when I say swearing, I don't just mean like low level, like you can still be a Christian swear type swears, but I mean like third degree, like real, like F-bombs, everything, and it was like, and here's what blew my mind. And I had some twisted theology. I don't know where it came from, not my parents, but I had read the stories of like Ananias and Sapphira and Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And so I just assumed like if you would like swear in a Christian school or something like that, like lightning bolts would just boom, But they were swearing, and they were okay. They could just do it and keep going, and life continued. And it kind of opened my eyes. It was kind of like my moment in the garden where it's just like opened my eyes to like, oh, the fruit looks good. I should try it. Where I was like, oh, I can try this. And, swearing was kind of this gateway where I started to exercise my own free will. And I started swearing, and as a result of that, I realized I'm not getting lightning bolted. I can kind of do whatever I want. And so I started following the patterns of my friends. Got into stealing and drinking and smoking and partying and pornography and bad choices with girls and all kinds of things. By the end of junior high, Christian schools, if you don't know, they have all the grades because they don't have enough students to just be a junior high or a high school or whatever, so it's small things. So they have all the grades. At the end of junior high, I had not been removed from my school, but at the end of grade 9, they kind of were like, the school wasn't actively trying to get me to come back, which is crazy because Christian schools are really hard up for money and they are always trying to get people back. So it said something there. Anyways, I ended up going to a new school in grade 10. And grade 10 was kind of like that climax year where things kind of blew up. Throughout the year, things were not going well. Our Christian school ran mission trip fundraisers, and my friends and I were actually we found ways to steal from the school and stuff. So our mission trip fundraisers actually lost money. They were running it a net negative and stuff like that because of me and my friends. And so the school found out, and they actually set up a kind of a sting operation, which sounds weird when I say it, but shortly after, I'm in the principal's office with the principal and a police officer. It's my first bout with the law, signing up for community service and all that. But I still got to stay in the school. A little bit later, there used to be this class called outdoor education. I don't know if that still exists. You'd do stuff outdoors. But we went on a camping trip as a small group of us from our little Christian school. And some friends and I decided to take some alcohol, and we got drunk on the trip, and we got busted, and we got kicked out. A number of us got kicked out of school. Now, it was the end of the school year, and the school was kind of gracious. I don't know if it was a financial decision or they were just being nice, but they let me finish up the school year just kind of from home, write my tests and all that. So I had to go to the school to collect my stuff. And here's kind of the point of the story. I remember being at the school in grade 10. This is a long time ago. And we're getting the stuff. My mom's there. And my mom was talking to this one teacher. And honestly, I don't remember this teacher's name, and I don't even remember what she taught me. But I just kind of sat in the hallway. At this point, I felt like, everyone's disappointed in me. My parents, my teachers, people at church, all that. And I don't really know how they felt about me, but just felt like the whole world was like disappointed in Ryan. It was just like, oh, Ryan's like, he's headed nowhere. He's making a disaster out of his life, which is actually kind of true. I was making a disaster out of my life. But I remember this moment where my mom was talking to this teacher and getting some stuff from this teacher for me to like take home. And the teacher was like crying. And I was kind of like, what the heck is going on? So I kind of just like look, because I'm kind of standing behind. And I remember the teacher just bawling and saying to my mom, and I'll never forget this, like this is a long time ago. There's so much I don't remember about that point in my life. And I look at my mom and saying, I'm so sad because Ryan has so much potential. Which at that moment in my life was a crazy thing to, like, part of me was kind of like, maybe she's the one doing drugs. It's like, no one else is saying that. But I'll remember that forever, because I think probably there were a lot of people who are thinking, good thing Ryan's not here anymore. He's not going to change. He would just be trouble if he came back next year. And in some ways, maybe that's true. Or, oh man, what a screw up. That kid's not headed anywhere. That kid's going to be in the system. It's going to be a mess. And this one teacher just saying, like, even despite everything that's going on, I see something in Ryan. I believe that change is possible. I believe that something good could come out of that life. Last week, I cracked into the story of this little dude in Luke 19 named Zacchaeus. And I think it's a pretty similar story. And I'm going to kind of recap, and we'll look at one verse. Jesus is in this part of the world where there's this chief tax collector, someone who's a bad dude. He's sinful, he's dishonest, he's hurting people, he's very selfish. He's becoming rich through exploiting people. All of us can agree that that's pretty bad. And he's probably been doing it for a long time. And he's probably been capitalizing for a long time. He's probably hurt very many people. And probably most people avoid him. Probably most people stay far away from him in the assumption that that's what Zacchaeus is like. That's what Zacchaeus will always be like. And this is kind of a little bit of like Ryan commentary, but I think that when we label people that way and we say, oh, they won't change, they're like that, they'll always be like that, and we start to have those ideas and stuff, like maybe people exist that way anyways, but I don't think that usually helps people who are on that type of a path. Oh, that person's a screw up, that person's a liar, that person's a dirtbag. So Jesus is coming through town, and he's becoming like quite popular. Big crowds are following him. People are listening. I mean, imagine this, like the God who created the universe puts on flesh, comes down to earth and starts walking around and teaching. How exciting would it have been to like reach out and touch him? How exciting would it be to just be like covered by his dust as he walks along the road, to watch him do miracles, to watch him teach all that. People are surrounding him. He's a little bit polarizing, but people are so interested and so excited. And there's this little dude named Zacchaeus who just wants to see Jesus. We get the idea that he's not even like looking for something more. He just wants to see Jesus. Imagine that he's just feeling in his life this desperation, like this hasn't gone the way I expected. This hasn't turned out the way I'd hoped. My life is kind of a mess, and he's looking for something more. So he runs ahead, finds this tree, climbs up into the tree. And he's like, if just I could see him, if I could just lay my eyes upon this Jesus. And Jesus walks along, and he looks up at Zacchaeus. He looks up at this person. And what does Jesus say? Does he say, hey, Zacchaeus, I've heard what you're like. I've heard what you've done. I've heard about your past. I've heard about you before. He could call him out. And I mean, rightfully so. He could say, go give people's money back. Don't be such a dirtbag. Don't be a liar. Stop hurting people. He could walk by. He could just ignore him. Ghost people. We do that, right? Sometimes when conflict arises, and we ghost people. Jesus could just ghost him. This guy's working for the enemy. He could walk right by him. Instead of him saying, I know about your past and your present, what Jesus does is he looks at him and he says, I see hope for your future. I'm not rating you based on your past and present, but I'm looking into your future, and I'm seeing something glorious there that could be something amazing. I spoke at 11 camps this summer, and what's nice about that is I can kind of share something, and you don't know which camps I'm talking about, so that's great. Something that camps do is when they have repeat campers, they'll like share some notes from the cabin leader from the year before. And in a lot of ways, I think that's quite helpful. There are one or two situations where I was at a camp where they're like, yeah, we get to like have the warnings so we like know like what challenges or what issues. And I mean, I think it's good sometimes to say, hey, like be aware of this, this happened with this camp or whatever. But it seemed in one or two environments that it was very much that the camper that had been there for 5 days a year prior was now being introduced and welcomed through a lens of a written report about them from a year before. Maybe some of it's accurate, maybe some of it's not. But that's a pretty tough journey to walk in life. If people are just like, hey, you did this one thing this one time, or you've done this, or you've been like this, and I'm going to start a relationship like that, rather than welcome you in as someone who has a bright and hopeful future. Last week I talked about being an empathetic community. And this week I just want to challenge us what it looks like to be a gospel-centered community that looks at people not based on their past, not based on their present, but looking to their future and say, you know what, life for all of us, not just for the person who isn't following Jesus, but for everybody, can be different in the future because of the work that Jesus does. All Jesus does is says, Zacchaeus, I want to come to your house. It's a way of saying, I welcome you in. I care about you. I believe in what you can become. It's like that teacher saying, I believe that he has so much potential. Jesus saying, I believe you have so much potential, Zacchaeus. And here, Zacchaeus, he speaks 2 sentences in the entire Bible. Verse 8, but Zacchaeus stood up, no one noticed because he was so short, and said to the Lord, sorry, bad joke, said to the Lord, look, Lord, first sentence, look, Lord, 2 words, look, Lord. That word Lord means like master, king, ruler. All of a sudden he's like, Jesus, you are now the master of my life. That sentence is the more powerful one. This is second sentence. Here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. I read this, I'm like, I wish I was someone that he had cheated, right? 4 times, that's a great ROI. I wish I had been exploited by Zacchaeus and be like, oh yeah, Zacchaeus, remember you took that from me? No keeping track, but like times 4, yeah, sweet, a little bit of interest. I wish. What's fascinating about this is we read that really quickly. But he gave away half of everything he had and then more. Again, I'm pretty sure none of you have seen someone come back from the dead. I'm also guessing that there's no one in this room, myself included, who's ever done that. Who's ever been like, you know what? I'm going to calculate what half of everything I own is and just give it away today. And then give a whole bunch more away. We don't do that. Zacchaeus is one of the most radical expressions of generosity in the history of humankind. He is up there with Mother Teresa. Now, I realize he has a bad backstory, but that's not what we look at when we think about the gospel. We look at what he did. If Jesus went into that community and said, hey, you know what, I've heard about this guy named Zacchaeus, he's talking to people, heard about this guy named Zacchaeus, he is going to be one of the most historical examples of what it means to be radically generous, people would have laughed. People would have mocked. They would have said, no, Jesus, he's a tax collector. He takes from us. He steals. And Jesus says, yeah, I know he's done that, but this is what's going to happen. People are like, no, people don't change. People never change. That's not what happens. And Zacchaeus becomes one of the craziest examples of what it means to acknowledge that when Jesus is the master of your life, we then become radically generous, a complete life change. I mean, how laughable is it that a story I shared about my life earlier? I mean, think about that story. No one in grade 10 was like, I bet one day Ryan is going to probably be working with a church in Vancouver, helping them through a season of transition, sharing the gospel on stage, things like that. None of my teachers were saying that. That would have been, if they said that, I'd be like, you're crazy. That's a really bad guess. And that's kind of an expression of the entire story of the Bible. I mean, you know the story of Moses, right? God goes to Moses. He's like, hey, Moses, I want you to lead millions of people out of slavery. I want you to lead them to worship me. I want you to lead them toward liberation. And what does Moses say? Moses says, not sure if you've noticed, God, I'm not so great at public speaking. And I've been told in my culture that public speaking is what makes a pastor. I've been told that public speaking is this necessary thing. I have to have this certain ability in order to do something great for you. And God just laughs. It's like, nah. What about Jeremiah? Do you know this story about Jeremiah where God goes to Jeremiah and says, hey, I want you to go and bring an important message to my people. Do you guys know what Jeremiah says? He says, I'm too young. Who told him that? Who the heck told Jeremiah he's too young? Where did that soundtrack come from that's playing through his mind? I hope Pilgrim, but the Canadian church, I hope we don't give don't give people those messages. You're too young, you're too old, you're too this. God can use, God can change, God can transform people of all shapes, sizes, ages, ethnicities, all of that. This happens all throughout the Bible. I mean, one of the reasons Jesus might wanted to have passed by Zacchaeus is because he doesn't want to get taxed by him. But then he remembers, I've got a tax collector in my crew. He can just tax him back, right? I mean, Jesus, he takes a tax collector, Matthew, brings him into his group. This guy was ripping people off, exploiting people. He goes on to write my favorite gospel in the Bible, the book of Matthew. There are all kinds of stories like this. What about Paul? Isn't the story of Paul? He's like persecuting the church. And if you read in Acts, what happens is God is like he's this crazy transformation. His life changes radically. And the people here like, oh, Paul's going to come work with you. And they're like, Paul? Like, give us anybody else, like anyone else. We'd rather take he's this great persecutor of the church. And God would say, yeah, he was a great persecutor of the church, but he's going to be one of the greatest promoters of the church moving forward. He writes lots of the New Testament. Peter, total train wreck so often. Many of the disciples probably are like, you guys know those people in life? This sounds bad, but those moments in life where you're like, I don't know if I'm good at this, but if that person can do it, I can do it. Or at least this person's on the team. Like they say, like, you don't have to run faster than a bear. You just have to run faster than one person when the bear is chasing you. I imagine there may be times where the disciples are just like, you know what? No matter how this shakes out, I'm not in 12th place like Peter's here, right? Like this guy walking dumpster fire sometimes. But Peter, it's like he's the guy that denied Jesus 3 times. And then he's the guy that preaches this great message where 3,000 people in one day decide to start following Jesus. I preach my heart in, week out, all the time. I'm happy if one person does it. 3,000 people. It's crazy. Those are all like kind of stories that turned out well. What about Judas? It's not like Jesus didn't know that Judas had some real issues. It's not like Jesus didn't know, it's not like he's surprised, Judas struggles with selfishness. It's weird because Jesus, I don't think was surprised. I think he knew his future, but still looked at him through a gospel-centered lens that says it is possible for people's lives to be transformed by the work of the gospel. And so I'm not going to write people off based on their past, but I'm going to give people the encouragement of what it looks like for a gospel-centered community to look at them with hope and say, your future can be one that's radically full of the kingdom of heaven. It's a cool thing. I'm so glad. I'm so grateful for that teacher. One day, maybe in eternity, maybe one day I'll figure out her name or in eternity or whatever. Grateful for her, people like her. I'm grateful for gospel-centered communities, youth pastors and people like that who looked at me, even at my worst screw-ups, and said, there's a bright hope and a future for you. And I'm grateful for Jesus, who looked at me, dead in my transgressions, a child of rebellion, a child of wrath, and said, I believe that you can change. May we be a community that embraces that idea that change, transformation is possible. The gospel isn't just for people who don't know Jesus. It's not just for people who do. It's this message of transformation and change that can come to all people when we truly embrace it and say, as a community, we want to live that out. And here's the last thing I'll say, and then we're going to go into a time of communion. Perhaps this message is really geared around people ascribing that wrong intention to others. People can never change, that person will never change. Maybe one of the real hang-ups for ourselves is that we just believe that about ourselves. It's I can never change. I'm such a screw-up. I'm a failure. I'm not good at this. I can't speak well. I'm too young. I'm too this. I've messed up. I can't change. I can't get out of this rhythm. I can't get out of this routine. I can't get out of this habit. I think Jesus would look at you and say, oh man, it's possible. If it's possible for this little tax collector dude in a tree to become what Zacchaeus becomes, you can become some great things because Jesus can change your life. Whether it's you believing that about yourself or about others, or maybe you're struggling with people believing that about you, I hope this can be a community that grows in the belief that people can change, that Jesus can change people. It's kind of the whole point of the communion meal. I mean, what's the point of Jesus dying on the cross if people can never change? He comes and dies for our sins, being wow, they're stuck there. They're never going to change anyways, so whatever. He didn't just come die for fun. He came with the knowledge that as his body breaks and he offers forgiveness for our sins through his broken body and through his blood shed on the cross, is that people's lives can be radically transformed by that. It's this picture and this icon when we think about Jesus, the crucified Jesus on the cross, that change, that new hope, that new life, is possible. In 2 Corinthians, it says, you've been made a new creation. You are back to life. You are made new again in who Jesus is. And maybe I'll give you a few intentions to kind of posture in your head as we enter into a time of communion.